Good morning. The reading today I want to focus on is taken from the Acts of the Apostles. It's the first reading from today's Mass. Some Jews arrived from Antioch and Iconium and turned the people against the apostles. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the town, thinking he was dead. The disciples came crowding round him, but as they did so, he stood up and went back into the town. The next day, he and Barnabas went off to Derbe. Having preached the good news in that town and made a considerable number of disciples, they went back through Lystra and Iconium to Antioch. They put fresh heart into the disciples, encouraging them to persevere in the faith. We have all to experience many hardships, they said, before we enter the kingdom of God. In each of these churches they appointed elders, and with prayer and fasting they commended them to the Lord, in whom they had come to believe. They passed through Pisidia and reached Pamphylia. Then, after proclaiming the word at Perga, they went down to Attalia and from there sailed for Antioch, where they had originally been commended to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. On their arrival, they assembled the church and gave an account of all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith to the pagans. They stayed there with the disciples for some time. The word of the Lord. As I said, I want to focus on the first reading from today's Mass, from the Acts of the Apostles. And we come today to the final description of Paul's and Barnabas' first missionary journey. At Lystra, they had been in the embarrassing situation of being taken for gods because of the cure of a paralysed man. But that glory was to be short-lived, because their enemies were on their tail. Those people whose hostility they had incurred in the towns of Antioch and Iconium now turned up and successfully stirred up the feelings of the people of Lystra against the two apostles. The same people who just now had been treating the apostles as gods moved on to have Paul stoned, leaving him for dead. But with the courage that so often marks his actions, Paul went back into the town, but the next day moved with Barnabas on to Derbe, their last stop on this journey. Now, when we listen to these stories, we realise that Paul must have been a very impressive preacher. And we can judge that by the success in all the towns in which he spoke. Now, they then began a return journey, going back through each of the towns they had originally evangelised, Lystra, Iconium and Antioch. And those same towns had been the ones in which they had previously met such violent resistance. But notwithstanding that resistance, we must remember that they had made many Christian converts amongst both Jews and Gentiles. And these converts were to be the seeds of new churches in each place. Paul put fresh heart into the newly converted disciples. He preached and warned them of the trials and difficulties that they could expect to face, just as he did. And he makes it clear this was a necessary condition to enter the kingdom of God. Now, you'll see that the Jerusalem Bible that we use in the lectionary reads that they appointed elders. Now, the translators rendered the Greek word presbyteros as elder. And while this is literally true, it's contextually wrong. Because presbyteros is the New Testament word for priest. The Greek did have a word for priest, hieros, but this word is used for priests who offer blood sacrifices. So, for example, for the pagan or for the older Jewish priests. So the New Testament church coined a different word for Christian priests, presbyteros. And today's reading ought to be translated better as in each church they ordained priests with fasting and prayer. In Greek, the verbal form of presbyteros is presbuin, which means an ambassador of. And this gives us a rather deeper idea of the word. Priests are called to be ambassadors of Christ. Now on Sunday, just gone, we heard of the institution of the ordained role of deacon. And thank you to Father John for his kind words. But here in this reading, we see the first instance of the apostles Paul and Barnabas instituting the role of priest. Now from Pisidian Antioch, Paul and Barnabas retraced their steps through Pisidia, Perga in Pamphylia, and down to the coastal town of Attalia, the main port of Pamphylia. And from there they went by ship back to Antioch in Syria. That's the city from which they had originally set out. And it's interesting that on their return, the two apostles gave a complete report of their mission experiences and told of how God had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles and how well they had accepted the message of the gospel. In fact, Paul and Barnabas left behind not just individual believers, but functioning communities with their own leadership under the leadership of those priests. So in our work for the church, we also need to report to the community of what we're doing and submit ourselves for evaluation and encouragement. So in that context, I ask you, please pray for our priests. Pray especially for Father John as we thank God for his ministry amongst us. God bless.